Picture this: you are crouched behind a marble column in the Vatican's most sacred halls. The stone is cold against your back, but the air is heavy, almost suffocating, thick with incense and something far more intoxicating: desire and danger. It is the year 1501 AD. The flickering light of candelabras throws long shadows across walls frescoed with saints and martyrs, figures who once represented virtue, now forced to witness what no mortal eyes should ever see within these holy chambers. You hear it first: the sound of silk rustling over polished marble, mingled with laughter, laughter too carefree, too shameless for these sacred corridors where holy men once whispered their prayers. Your heart races as you realize you are on the edge of history's most scandalous evening, an orgy so depraved that even the libertines of ancient Rome might have blushed. It is October in Rome, the season when the air smells of smoke and roasted chestnuts sold in bustling streets. Those same chestnuts, humble autumn fruits, will soon become instruments of spectacle in a performance so obscene it will stain the very name of the papacy. In the private chambers of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, 50 courtesans prepare for a night that will be etched forever in whispered rumors, secret diaries, and the fearful imagination of Europe. The Vatican, the heart of Christendom, has become a theatre where the sacred and profane intertwine. To many outside its walls, the Pope was God's vicar on earth, the custodian of souls. Yet here, behind curtains of silk and guarded doors, that same office is mocked, its dignity crumbling in candlelight. In this moment, the very contradiction of Renaissance Rome comes alive, a city where salvation was preached in sunlight and sin was purchased in shadows. Contemporaries would call it il banchetto delle castagne, the banquet of chestnuts, the night when power, lust, and ambition converged beneath the frescoed ceilings of the apostolic palace. Eyewitnesses would preserve its details in dry Latin prose, unwilling or perhaps unable to add judgment to the words. And yet the truth of what happened that night would echo for centuries, whispered in corridors of power and debated by historians. It is no coincidence that the chosen night was October 31st, All Hallows' Eve. In medieval tradition, this was the liminal moment when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, when souls wandered and shadows lengthened. Was Cesare's choice deliberate? Did he wish to cloak his scandal in the eerie symbolism of a night when ghosts roamed and sin seemed strangely permissible? Or was it chance alone that aligned the infamous orgy with this ancient night of transition? Perhaps that is why the scandal would live on, not only for its obscenity, but for its symbolism. In a single night, the Borgias embodied the Renaissance paradox itself: human brilliance and depravity, divine symbols desecrated by worldly ambition. The candles that glowed in those Vatican chambers did more than illuminate bodies and laughter. They illuminated a truth Europe could not ignore. When power escapes morality, nothing, not even the sacred, is safe. And so we begin with shadows, with laughter where prayers once rose, with chestnuts scattered across marble floors as symbols of a church that had lost its way. But to understand how this night came to pass, we must step backward into the dust of Spain, where a boy named Rodrigo Borgia first dreamed of power, and into the streets of Rome, where vice and virtue danced in dangerous embrace. The man who would one day be known as the most scandalous pope in history entered the world far from the grandeur of Rome. Rodrigo de Borgia was born on January 1st, 1431, in the small Spanish town of Sativa, near Valencia. The landscape there was one of orange groves and dusty roads where sunlight poured relentlessly over stone houses and olive trees. It was not a birthplace one would imagine for a future pontiff, let alone one who would redefine the papacy with both magnificence and infamy. Yet, As history so often proves, power has a way of flowing from the most unlikely of origins. Rodrigo was born into a family whose ambitions stretched far beyond the dusty lanes of their provincial town. His uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, had already begun to climb the formidable ladder of the Catholic hierarchy. When Alfonso ascended to the papacy in 1455 as Pope Calixtus III, Rodrigo's fate was sealed like wax pressed against parchment. Nepotism, so deeply ingrained in the Church of the Renaissance, became his inheritance. At the age of 25, Rodrigo was made cardinal deacon, not because of holy devotion, not because of theological brilliance, but because blood ties ran thicker than vows of chastity or vows of service. From that moment, ambition burned in him like an unquenchable fire. The young Spaniard arrived in Rome, eyes wide with hunger, chest heaving with determination. He had left behind the dust and the orange blossoms of Valencia for marble columns, gilded chapels, and the intoxicating chaos of the Eternal City. Rome, in the mid-15th century, was a contradiction given flesh, a place where pilgrims walked barefoot toward altars dripping with gold, and where brothels flourished in the same neighborhoods as convents. It was a city both holy and wicked, a mirror of human frailty. Rodrigo entered this world not as a pilgrim, but as a predator. He quickly learned the rules of the game. Every promise could be bought, every favor sold, every office negotiated like merchandise in a market stall. Rodrigo thrived in this world, his sharp mind and iron will making him indispensable in the papal curia. He was methodical, almost spider-like, weaving webs of patronage across Europe. He collected benefices, those lucrative church positions that provided steady income, like a merchant hoarding gems. Soon his coffers overflowed and his reputation spread. He lived not as a humble cardinal, but as a Renaissance prince, banquets that glittered with silver goblets, palaces adorned with velvet and marble, and women who entered his life as mistresses and left as mothers of his children. Here was a man utterly at home in contradiction, a priest sworn to celibacy yet surrounded by lovers, a servant of God yet living as if God's riches were his inheritance. Rodrigo's ambition was not limited to wealth, it extended to legacy. He saw his children not as burdens but as pawns in a great game. Each one would carry his name forward, carved into the dynastic chessboard of Renaissance Italy. Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre would not live as shadows of a scandalous priest. They would become actors in a dark play of power that stretched across the continent. What is striking is not simply Rodrigo's brazenness, but the fact that even then, long before he became Pope Alexander VI, he was already infamous. His scandals were whispered throughout Rome, his conduct criticized even by men accustomed to corruption. In 1460, Pope Pius II himself wrote Rodrigo a blistering letter condemning his behavior in Siena, where his indulgences had shocked the town and its court. Yet Rodrigo was unmoved. Shame, after all, was a luxury he could not afford. He had seen his path, and it led to the highest throne on earth. If he was to climb, it would be with gold in his hands and ambition in his eyes, not prayers on his lips. And so by the late 15th century, Rodrigo Borgia stood not as a humble servant of the Church, but as one of its most powerful figures, his shadow stretching across Rome like that of the marble obelisks left behind by the emperors of old. He was already notorious, already feared, already admired by those who prized ruthlessness above sanctity. The dust of Valencia clung to his memory, but destiny now dressed him in crimson silk. Yet still, his story had only begun. For the conclave of 1492 was waiting, and with it, Rodrigo would seize the crown of St. Peter, not through holiness, but through gold, cunning, and an ambition that would defy even God. To understand Rodrigo Borgia's ascent, one must first understand the stage upon which he played his great drama, Renaissance Rome. It was a city unlike any other, both a holy capital and a den of vice, a place where heaven and hell seemed to trade places with alarming ease. By day, pilgrims from across Christendom streamed into its gates. They came barefoot, dusty from weeks on the road, clutching wooden crosses or rosaries. Their voices rose in hymns as they shuffled toward St. Peter's Basilica, their eyes wide with awe as sunlight blazed against domes and gilded altars. To them, Rome was the city of salvation, the place where Peter's bones lay, and where heaven seemed a little closer to earth. But by night, the city transformed. The same streets that echoed with prayers at noon now rang with drunken laughter. Courtesans leaned from shadowed doorways, their silk dresses catching torchlight, while men of wealth and rank disappeared behind heavy curtains into houses of pleasure. Gambling dens rattled with dice, mercenaries clashed in taverns, and beneath it all, gold exchanged hands faster than blessings at the altar. Rome had become a marketplace of souls where everything from indulgences to political favors could be bought if one had the coin. Rodrigo understood this duality instinctively. To him, Rome was not a contradiction, but an opportunity. He moved with ease from the solemnity of papal ceremonies to the decadence of midnight banquets. Where others saw hypocrisy, Rodrigo saw power. If the people desired salvation in the morning and sin by nightfall, then he would give them both, and profit from each in turn. He accumulated benefices across Europe, carefully spinning his web of wealth and influence. His palaces rivaled those of princes, with marble floors polished to mirrors and walls hung with tapestries from Flanders. Banquets flowed with roasted peacocks, fountains spouted wine, and musicians played until dawn. The luxury of his life was no secret, but neither was it unusual in a Rome where cardinals were as much princes as priests. What set Rodrigo apart was not his taste for indulgence, but the relentless precision with which he pursued it. Like a spider, every move was calculated, every thread of his web anchored in gold. But his excesses did not pass unnoticed. Rome was a city of gossip, its air thick with rumors carried from tavern to convent, from palace to marketplace. The name Borgia became synonymous with scandal long before Rodrigo's papal election. Whispers of mistresses, of children born out of vows of celibacy, of deals struck in shadowed chambers, they spread like wildfire through the eternal city. Yet Rodrigo thrived on it. Reputation, whether good or infamous, was still power. The contrast of Rome itself amplified the contradictions in Rodrigo's own life. Here was a man who heard confessions by day and held lovers by night, a man who dispensed justice in crimson robes while plotting family alliances over goblets of spiced wine. In many ways he was Rome incarnate, gilded and holy on the surface, corrupt and ravenous beneath. And yet this was not merely personal indulgence. Rodrigo's vision extended beyond himself. His family, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre, were not accidents of passion, but instruments of strategy. Each child was a future duke, duchess, or cardinal, pawns to be maneuvered across the board of European politics. Rome's contradictions became the soil in which Rodrigo's dynasty would take root, watered by scandal but nourished by ambition. It was a dangerous city, but Rodrigo thrived in danger. In the very chaos of Rome's double life, he saw the map of his future. All he needed now was the throne of St. Peter, and the eternal city itself would bend to his will. Behind Rodrigo Borgia's crimson robes and gilded halls lay a truth Rome could not ignore. He was a man of appetite, and those appetites were not confined to food or power. His most enduring relationship was with a Roman noblewoman, Vanozza de Catane. Unlike fleeting mistresses, Vanozza was no passing indulgence. She was clever, well-connected, and knew how to survive in a city where scandal could ruin or elevate a family in equal measure. Between 1474 and 1482, she bore Rodrigo 4 children: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. Each child was baptized not only into life but into politics, for Rodrigo never saw them as liabilities. To him, they were pawns, living extensions of his ambition. Where other men might have hidden their illegitimate offspring in convents or faraway estates, Rodrigo flaunted his children, placing them openly into the very structures of power. Juan, the golden boy, was destined for nobility. Handsome, brash, and indulgent, Rodrigo imagined him as a prince whose charm would open doors across Europe. Cesare, darker, sharper, and far more calculating, was pushed into the church, appointed Archbishop of Valencia while still in his teens. Yet even then, his eyes burned not with piety, but with the cold fire of a soldier. Lucrezia, beautiful and delicate, would be married and remarried as her father's alliances shifted, her life reduced to ink on contracts sealed in wax. And Joffre, the youngest, was tied into southern Italian politics through a marriage alliance forged while he was still a boy. Each child became a chess piece Rodrigo moved across the board of Christendom. His love for them was real, but it was inseparable from strategy. Affection and ambition blurred in ways that unsettled even his allies. To Rodrigo, a child's smile was both a father's joy and a weapon sharpened for political gain. For Rome, of course, took notice. In a city of priests and pilgrims, it was scandalous enough that a cardinal had children, but that these children were openly paraded as dynastic players made Rodrigo infamous. The contradiction was almost grotesque. The man who should have embodied celibacy instead fathered a family as ambitious and visible as any royal house in Europe. Yet the hypocrisy did not weaken him, it strengthened his mystique. Rodrigo was a man who lived above the rules he was sworn to uphold, a man for whom even God's law bent beneath the weight of his will. This blending of sacred duty with worldly passion was not unique to Rodrigo. Throughout Renaissance Europe, noble mistresses were commonplace. Kings flaunted them, cardinals kept them, and entire dynasties were shaped by love affairs whispered in private chambers. But Rodrigo's brazenness stood out because of where he stood, at the very gates of sainthood, draped in robes meant to symbolize sacrifice and devotion. The more openly he broke those vows, the more unforgettable he became. For Vanozza, too, survival was an art. She understood that her role was temporary, a stepping stone in Rodrigo's life. When he inevitably shifted his affections to younger mistresses, she did not fade into obscurity but secured her position through her children, who carried her name into the heart of papal politics. It was a survival strategy many noblewomen of the era would have recognized: play the role, endure the humiliation, and secure a legacy through one's offspring. What Rodrigo built with his mistresses was not merely scandal but dynasty. He was no ordinary cardinal with secret lovers. He was the architect of a family that would leave Europe trembling. The children born of passion would soon be thrust into roles that demanded blood, loyalty, and sacrifice. And as their father climbed toward the throne of St. Peter, each of them would learn the price of being a pawn in a game where the stakes were nothing less than kingdoms. Long before Rodrigo Borgia ever wore the papal tiara, his name was already whispered with scandal. Rome was no stranger to corruption. Its streets buzzed with rumors of cardinals who kept mistresses, gambled away fortunes, or traded sacred offices like market wares. But even in such an environment, Rodrigo's conduct stood out. He was brazen in ways that shocked even the jaded courtiers of the Renaissance. One episode, in particular, was remembered with embarrassment by the Church itself. In 1460, Pope Pius II An intellectual pontiff who prided himself on both moral rigor and humanist learning was forced to confront his young cardinal nephew's reckless behavior. Rodrigo had attended festivities in Siena where his indulgences became the talk of the town. The Pope, humiliated, wrote him a scathing letter, condemning the excesses that had shocked the whole court. It was not merely the presence of women that caused outrage, but the open flaunting of wealth, lust, and irreverence for the role he was meant to embody. Rodrigo's answer to such rebuke was not contrition, but defiance. To him, the reprimand of Pius II was not a warning, but a nuisance, an obstacle to be brushed aside on the path toward higher power. Shame was a currency Rodrigo did not trade in. If others blushed at scandal, he thrived on it. Yet, this audacity was precisely what drew supporters to him. Many among Rome's nobility admired his fearlessness, his refusal to play the hypocrite by hiding behind piety. In Rodrigo, they saw someone who lived as they did, reveling in wealth, wine, and women, only magnified to princely proportions. He became a figure of fascination, both admired and despised, envied and feared. By the 1470s and 1480s, Rodrigo's household had become notorious. His feasts rivaled those of dukes, his mistresses the subject of endless gossip. He moved through the Vatican with confidence, his crimson robes swaying not like a humble cleric's garment, but like the cloak of a monarch. Rome's people began to call him Il Cardinale Borgia, with equal parts mockery and awe. He was larger than life, a man who seemed untouchable, armored by wealth and connections, and yet, behind the glitter, there was always calculation. Rodrigo's scandalous behavior was not simply appetite, it was strategy. By flaunting his power, he reminded others of his immunity. By shocking with excess, he showed that he lived above reproach. In a church where hypocrisy was rampant, Rodrigo's transparency in vice made him, paradoxically, more trustworthy to those who sought alliances. After all, one always knew where he stood. He wanted power, he wanted wealth, and he would do anything to get them. Still, whispers grew louder. Cardinals muttered behind closed doors, nobles gossiped at banquets, and even allies began to wonder how far Rodrigo would go. Could such a man truly aspire to the throne of St. Peter? Or was his ambition destined to collapse under the weight of his scandals? But Rodrigo knew better. He understood the inner workings of the church like few others. Scandal could stain reputation, yes, but gold could cleanse it. Indignation might linger, but favors bought in coin or influence were far more enduring. Every disapproving letter, every whispered accusation, every scandalous feast, they were mere stepping stones on the path to the papacy. And when the conclave of 1492 arrived, Rodrigo was ready. Armed not with prayers, but with wealth, promises, and ruthless cunning, he would silence the whispers of his critics the way he always had, by outspending, outmaneuvering, and outlasting them. The greatest scandal of all was yet to come. Rodrigo Borgia was about to become Pope Alexander VI. The summer of 1492 was heavy with heat and expectation. The death of Pope Innocent VIII had left the chair of St. Peter vacant, and 23 cardinals gathered within the Sistine Chapel to decide who would wear the papal tiara next. Above them loomed frescoed saints, their painted eyes gazing down as if to remind the electors of their sacred duty. But in truth, the conclave was less a council of the holy and more a marketplace of corruption. Rodrigo Borgia entered the conclave armed not with humility but with gold. Bags of ducats were readied like soldiers waiting for battle. Promises of benefices, offices, and bishoprics filled the air like whispered prayers. In the hush of candlelight, Rodrigo spun his web, each cardinal a fly to be caught with money, power, or favor. It was not divine inspiration that guided their votes, but the oldest transaction known to man, exchange. The air in the Sistine Chapel grew thick, not with incense, but with murmurs of bargaining. One seat here, one abbacy there, a nephew appointed to a lucrative diocese, a cousin gifted a palace. Rodrigo's offers spread like wildfire through the chamber, and his rivals found themselves outmaneuvered by his sheer ruthlessness. Simony, the buying and selling of sacred offices, was hardly new, but never before had it been conducted with such boldness, such precision, such brazenness in the very room where the Holy Spirit was believed to descend. On August 11, 1492, the smoke rose. The signal to the waiting crowds was clear. A pope had been chosen. When the name was announced, it shocked no one. Rodrigo Borgia had triumphed. He took the name Alexander VI, stepping into history not as the shepherd of souls, but as the master of deals. Rome erupted in celebration. Bonfires lit the night, torchlit processions wound through its ancient streets, and triumphal arches sprang up in his honor. The people, oddly enough, were pleased. After all, they had grown accustomed to the Spaniards' wealth and charisma. They expected magnificence, and Alexander VI promised just that. 2 weeks later, his coronation at St. Peter's Basilica was described by witnesses as the most magnificent in living memory. Golden tapestries hung from balconies, choirs filled the air with music, and nobles rode proudly on horseback through the city. It was a spectacle meant not just to honor a pope, but to announce a dynasty. Alexander VI had purchased the papacy, and now he intended to rule it as if it were a kingdom. Yet beneath the glitter, the truth remained. This was no victory of holiness, it was the triumph of ambition. Simony had won the day, and Alexander's election was an open secret. Foreign ambassadors recorded the corruption in their reports, spreading word across Europe that the papacy itself could be bought like a merchant's goods. For some it was scandal, for others it was opportunity. If the papacy could be purchased once, it could be manipulated again. And still, Alexander seemed unshaken by the whispers. In fact, he embraced them. Power, he believed, revealed character. He had fought for the throne of Peter with every weapon at his disposal, money, promises, and audacity. Why should he feel shame for succeeding where others had hesitated? To him, the papal tiara was not a spiritual crown, but a prize of conquest. He had bought it, yes. But in Renaissance Rome, was that not proof that he deserved it? At first, it seemed as though the impossible had happened. Pope Alexander VI, despite the stench of simony that clung to his election, began his reign with reform. Rome, a city teetering on the edge of chaos, felt the first stirrings of order under the hand of this Spanish pontiff. The Eternal City in 1492 was drowning in violence. In the months before his coronation, more than 200 murders had been recorded in the streets. Knives flashed in alleys, noble rivalries spilled blood onto cobblestones, and the law seemed powerless. Yet Alexander acted swiftly. He divided Rome into districts, appointing magistrates empowered to maintain peace. Soldiers patrolled where thieves had once ruled. Even more astonishingly, the Pope himself presided over weekly audiences each Tuesday, where the common people could bring grievances directly before him. Chroniclers recorded their admiration. Justice was being dispensed not by distant officials, but by the Vicar of Christ himself. For a fleeting moment it seemed divine providence had guided Rodrigo Borgia to the papal throne. His stern efficiency reminded the people of a monarch, not merely a pontiff. Crowds cheered, and ambassadors noted in their letters that perhaps this scandalous Spaniard might surprise them all. But power does not create character. It reveals it. And Rodrigo Borgia was not suddenly transformed into a holy shepherd of souls. The very same ambition that had carried him from dusty Valencia to the papal tiara soon redirected itself, not toward Rome's salvation, but toward his family's glory. His children became the axis upon which his papacy turned. Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre, these were not simply offspring, but dynastic weapons. Within months, Alexander had begun carving out titles for them with the precision of a general placing troops on a battlefield. Juan was raised to Duke of Gandia and married into Spanish nobility, his future secured through kinship with the royal house. Cesare, though only 18, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia and soon elevated to cardinal, positions he regarded not as sacred offices but as stepping stones. Even Lucrezia, still young, was already being prepared for marriage alliances that would tether powerful families to the Borgias. Thus, the contradiction of Alexander VI emerged clearly, a pope who began with reforms and justice, only to drown his reign in nepotism. The man who once walked among petitioners to hear their cries now spent his energy securing dukedoms, bishoprics, and lands for his illegitimate children. In his hands, the papacy ceased to be a universal institution of Christendom. It became a family enterprise. The Vatican apartments during these early years reflected this tension between sacred duty and worldly indulgence. One week, Alexander presided over solemn masses at St. Peter's, the incense curling upward like prayers for renewal. The next, his chambers hosted dinners that stretched into dawn, banquets filled with laughter, music, and spectacles that blurred the line between refinement and obscenity. Even his mistress, Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella for her extraordinary beauty, moved freely through the papal corridors, her presence a daily reminder that vows of celibacy had been trampled beneath the weight of earthly desire. Rome had seen corrupt popes before, but never one so shameless, so unflinching in mixing the sacred with the profane. And yet, the contradiction made him magnetic. Alexander VI was efficient, charismatic, scandalous, and untouchable all at once. To his enemies, he embodied the corruption of the Church. To his allies, he was a master of politics. To his children, he was both father and kingmaker, shaping their futures with the papacy as his weapon. For Rome, this paradox was intoxicating. Here was a pope who restored order with one hand and shattered holiness with the other. The Eternal City had not seen such a figure in generations, and it would never forget him. To call Alexander VI a pope is only half the truth. He was also a patriarch, and the Vatican his family estate. What other pontiffs had guarded for Christendom, Alexander wielded for the Borgias. His papacy became a dynasty in motion, a machine grinding ceaselessly to elevate his children to thrones, duchies, and courts across Europe. Juan Borgia, his eldest son, was the favored heir to this vision. Handsome and flamboyant, he was showered with titles and honors, Duke of Gandia in Spain, commander of papal forces, and husband to a cousin of the Spanish king. But beneath the golden titles lay weakness. Juan was vain, indulgent, and careless, more suited to the pleasures of feasting and seduction than to governance or war. Still, Alexander clung to him as his golden boy, the living symbol of the Borgia dynasty's legitimacy. Then there was Cesare. Unlike Juan, Cesare possessed a mind as sharp as any sword. His intelligence was cold, calculating, and relentless. As a teenager, he had been forced into the church, crowned with the red hat of a cardinal before his soul had even hardened into belief. But in Cesare's eyes burned not devotion, but ambition of a different kind, the ambition of a conqueror. If Juan was meant to be the heir of titles, Cesare was born to wield the steel. Lucrezia, their sister, was no less instrumental. Blonde-haired, graceful, and charming, she was destined not for cloisters, but for marriage alliances. Each of her unions would be negotiated like treaties, sealing the Borgia's ties with rival houses or strengthening their hold over Italian principalities. To the public, she was a pawn, an obedient daughter. But in reality, Lucrezia was both pawn and player, a woman whose reputation would oscillate between saintly duchess and scandalous temptress, depending on who told the tale. The youngest, Joffre, still a boy, was not spared from the dynastic chessboard. At just 12, he was married to the illegitimate daughter of Alfonso II of Naples, binding the Borgias to the turbulent politics of southern Italy. Even his youth was no protection against his father's relentless strategy. Thus, each child became a pillar of Alexander's design. Juan, the noble heir; Cesare, the weapon; Lucrezia, the diplomat; Joffre, the binding tie. Their futures were written not in prayers, but in blood and marriage contracts. For Rome, this was an outrage. The papacy, once seen as the throne of St. Peter, was now transformed into the family estate of the Borgias. Cardinals muttered in indignation, rival families seethed with jealousy, and whispers grew that Alexander VI was less a pope than a monarch, building a dynasty from the very heart of Christendom. Yet outrage was powerless against Alexander's will. He had wealth, armies, and the charisma to bend opposition into silence. Inside the Vatican, sacred spaces became stages for family theatre. Portraits of the Borgia children hung in papal chambers, their youthful faces gazing out like heirs to a kingdom rather than offspring of a celibate pontiff. Foreign ambassadors recorded the brazenness with fascination. They saw not just a family, but a royal house in the making, one that used the papal throne as its launching pad. The contradiction could not have been more glaring. In sermons, Alexander spoke of God's justice and the salvation of souls, but in practice he maneuvered as a patriarch, securing dukedoms for sons, annulments for daughters, and lands for nephews. Where others saw a universal church, Alexander saw his family throne. It was nepotism elevated to an art form, shameless, unstoppable, and unforgettable. And the world was only beginning to witness the consequences of the Borgia dynasty's rise. If Rodrigo Borgia's children were the pillars of his dynasty, his mistresses were the shadows that gave it life. Among them, one figure stood out so brightly that Rome could not look away. Julia Farnese, known across the city as Julia la Bella, Julia the Beautiful. Julia was no ordinary mistress hidden behind cloistered doors. She was a vision of Renaissance ideals, tall, fair-skinned, with golden hair that tumbled like threads of sunlight, and eyes that glimmered with intelligence as much as beauty. Married young into the Farnese family, she quickly became more than just a noble wife. She became the living scandal of the Vatican. For Julia was openly, undeniably, the Pope's lover. She moved through the papal apartments with the grace of a queen, her presence impossible to disguise. Rome's gossip mills ground endlessly with her name, whispering of her beauty, her influence, and the audacity of her situation. Never before had a pope's mistress so boldly paraded through the corridors of St. Peter's as though they belonged to her. And in truth, they nearly did. For Alexander VI adored her with a devotion that astonished even his allies. She was barely 20 when their affair began, radiant with youth while he was past 60, heavy with age but still vigorous with ambition. To his critics it was grotesque, to his supporters it was proof of his vitality. In either case it was unforgettable. Her influence was more than ornamental. Through her, the Farnese family's fortunes rose. Her brother, Alessandro Farnese, once an obscure churchman, was elevated to the College of Cardinals, a decision whispered to be the fruit of her beauty rather than his merit. In time, Alessandro would ascend to the papacy himself as Pope Paul III, the very pontiff who would open the Council of Trent and reshape Catholicism in the age of the Counter-Reformation. Thus, Julia's affair with Alexander VI would echo far beyond scandal. It would alter the very course of the Church. But in the streets of Rome, the people did not see such distant consequences. They saw only the scandal. They saw the Pope's mistress travelling in carriages as fine as any noblewoman's, dressed in silks, her presence blurring the line between consort and courtesan. They whispered her name in taverns, laughed about her behind cloister walls, and mocked the Vatican where saints were meant to reign, but where beauty reigned instead. The contradiction was striking. In public, Alexander VI presided over solemn ceremonies, draped in gold vestments, his voice intoning Latin prayers that echoed through the marble canyons of St. Peter's. But in private, the same halls resounded with Julia's laughter, her footsteps trailing behind the most powerful man in Christendom. To some, she was merely the symbol of Alexander's corruption, a living testament to his broken vows. To others, she was something more complicated, a young woman caught between love, survival, and power. Did she adore the Pope, or did she simply play the role history had thrust upon her? The sources remain silent, but the image endures. Julia la Bella, the mistress of the Vatican, standing as both scandal and queen in a court where sacred and profane had become indistinguishable. In the midst of the Vatican's splendor, ambition, and scandal, one man walked quietly, almost invisibly, yet saw everything. His name was Johann Burchard, and though history rarely remembers him with the fame of popes or princes, his pen would preserve the truth of what others wished forgotten. Born around 1450 in Alsace, Burchard was not a man of power, but of duty. He studied canon law, mastered the complex rituals of the Church, and slowly rose through the ranks until he was appointed Magister Ceremoniarum Apostolicarum, the papal master of ceremonies. His task was precise and demanding, to record every papal ceremony, to ensure rituals were carried out with exacting order, and to maintain the dignity of the Holy See. He was in many ways the Vatican's memory. But Burchard was more than a ceremonial clerk. His mind was meticulous, his hand steady, and his gaze unflinching. In 1483, under Pope Sixtus IV, he began keeping a diary he called the Liber Notarum, a detailed chronicle of papal life. Year after year, pope after pope, Burchard recorded everything. The grand coronations, the processions, the marriages, the funerals, and, crucially, the scandals. Where other chroniclers embroidered tales with moral judgment or rhetorical flourish, Burchard wrote with the cold detachment of an accountant balancing books. His Latin was clipped, his tone dry, his entries devoid of commentary. But it was precisely this lack of ornament that gave his words their chilling weight. To read Burchard's diary is to witness corruption laid bare without disguise, vice stripped of excuse. He occupied a curious place in the papal court, close enough to observe every private detail, yet too minor to be considered a threat. Cardinals, nobles, and even popes grew accustomed to his presence, treating him like furniture, a shadow in the room. This invisibility became his strength. While others indulged in feasts and whispered secrets, Burchard quietly recorded. Every oath broken, every mistress paraded, every ceremony twisted for political ends. His pen caught them all. In the reign of Alexander VI, Burchard's diary became a mirror of contradiction. One page might describe a breathtaking mass, incense curling to the ceiling of St. Peter's, the Pope draped in gold as the choir thundered hymns. The next might coldly note the Pope's mistress attending supper in papal chambers, or the outrageous revelry of a Borgia banquet. He wrote of the infamous nights without anger, without shock, simply as fact. Perhaps that is why his record endures, because it does not try to persuade, it only preserves. Historians, centuries later, would pore over his pages in disbelief. Could such things truly have happened in the Vatican itself? Yet Burchard's very dryness makes him credible. His diary is no satire, no rumour, no moral tract. It is the ledger of a man who saw everything and exaggerated nothing. In time, Burchard would witness events that would shake Europe: the rise and fall of Alexander VI, the ruthless campaigns of Cesare Borgia, and even the infamous night that would be remembered as the Banquet of Chestnuts. His pen, steady as ever, would capture that evening in lines that scandalized the Church for centuries. But in these years of rising power, as Alexander tightened his hold on Rome and the Borgias built their dynasty, Burchard remained in the background, watching, recording, immortalizing. The popes might have wielded crowns, armies, and mistresses, but Burchard held something more enduring: the truth. The summer of 1497 should have been triumphant for the Borgias. Alexander VI had secured titles for his children, alliances for his dynasty, and stability in Rome. Yet beneath the glitter of processions and banquets, tensions simmered. Rival noble houses resented the Borgias' sudden rise. Whispers of betrayal circulated in smoky halls, and even within the family, jealousy brewed. Then came the night of June 14th. Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia and commander of the papal forces, vanished. Rome stirred with rumour the next morning, for Juan was no ordinary noble. He was the Pope's favoured son, his pride, his heir. Servants whispered of him leaving a feast that night, accompanied by shadowy figures. Hours passed, and then days, but no sign of Juan returned to the papal palace. 3 days later, his body was found floating in the murky waters of the Tiber River. His throat had been slit, his body stabbed 9 times. Weighted with stones, it had been meant to sink unseen into the darkness. Yet fate delivered him back to the city as a grotesque offering. The discovery stunned Rome, for if the Pope's son could be murdered so brazenly, what safety remained for anyone? Alexander VI was shattered. The pontiff, who had always carried himself with the imperious authority of a monarch, now wept like a broken father. Chroniclers wrote that for 3 days he refused food or sleep, shut away in grief, his cries echoing through the Vatican chambers. Some wondered aloud if divine justice had finally fallen upon the house of Borgia. Others whispered a darker question: who had wielded the knife? Theories multiplied like shadows at dusk. Some said rival noble families, the Orsini or Colonna, had struck back against papal favoritism. Others pointed to jealous husbands of women Juan had seduced. His reputation for reckless desire was infamous. And still others whispered the most dangerous suspicion of all, that Cesare, his own brother, had orchestrated the murder. For Cesare's cold ambition had long been caged by Juan's role as favoured son. Remove Juan, and the field was open for Cesare to abandon the church and pursue the destiny he truly desired: war, conquest, and a crown. The truth was never proven. The murder remained one of Rome's great unsolved crimes, a riddle buried beneath centuries of speculation. Yet its impact was immediate. Alexander, crushed by grief, announced sweeping reforms. He vowed to curb the excesses of the papal court, to suppress simony, to restrain luxury, to restore the dignity of the Church. He commissioned a body of cardinals to draft ordinances that anticipated the reforms of the Council of Trent, reforms that would not officially arrive for decades. For a brief moment, the world held its breath. Was tragedy enough to transform Alexander VI from corrupt patriarch to true shepherd of Christendom? Could the death of his beloved Juan redeem the papacy itself? But grief, like every passion in Rodrigo Borgia's life, proved fleeting. Within months, The reforms were forgotten, the ordinances shelved like old love letters. The Pope's tears dried, and his ambitions turned once more to his surviving children. Juan had been the heart, but Cesare was the sword, and now, unbound by rivalry, Cesare would wield that sword without mercy. The blood in the Tiber did not end the Borgia story. It marked a turning point. The dynasty had lost its golden heir, but in his place rose something far more dangerous, Cesare Borgia, unchained. The murder of Juan left a void in the Borgia dynasty, but it also opened a door. Into that space stepped Cesare, tall, striking, and far more formidable than his ill-fated brother. If Juan had been the gilded prince, Cesare was the steel hidden beneath the velvet. Ruthless, intelligent, and utterly without hesitation, he would soon embody the most terrifying aspect of his family's ambition. From the moment of his birth, Cesare's life had been forced into the cassock. While his brother was groomed for worldly power, Cesare was appointed Archbishop of Valencia at the age of 17, elevated to the College of Cardinals not long after. Yet he wore the robes of the church like a soldier wears a shroud, unwillingly, impatiently, and always with one hand reaching for the sword. Those who met him remarked on his presence, handsome, magnetic, yet cold. He carried himself with the bearing of a commander, not a cleric. Juan's death gave him the chance he had long awaited. In 1498, in a move unprecedented in papal history, Cesare resigned the cardinalate. He cast off the red hat that symbolized his sacred office, exchanging it for armor and ambition. Never before had a cardinal voluntarily abandoned such a position. To contemporaries, it was shocking. To Cesare, it was liberation. He was finally free to claim his destiny. The timing was perfect. Across the Alps, King Louis XIV of France needed papal support for the annulment of his marriage. Alexander VI, always ready to trade spiritual authority for political advantage, offered approval, but at a price. Louis would support Cesare's campaigns in Italy, arming the Pope's son with French soldiers, titles, and influence. In return, Cesare would become Duke of Valentinois, earning the nickname by which he would be remembered, Il Valentino. With French backing, Cesare began carving out a state of his own in central Italy. Cities fell before him in rapid succession: Imola, Forlì, Pesaro, Rimini. He used every tool at his disposal: siege, warfare, assassination, bribery, intimidation. To some he was a new Caesar, uniting fractured lands under a single, ruthless vision. To others, he was a devil in armor, a butcher cloaked in princely robes. What made Cesare terrifying was not merely his violence, but his precision. He did not kill for pleasure, he killed for purpose. Allies who betrayed him vanished overnight. Enemies who wavered were given one chance, and one chance only, to submit. Machiavelli, sent as an envoy to observe him, was both horrified and mesmerized. Years later, when he wrote The Prince, it was Cesare Borgia he held up as the model of effective, if merciless, rule. Cesare, he argued, had achieved the perfect balance: cruelty wielded not chaotically, but with cold efficiency, always in service of power. Meanwhile, Alexander VI watched with paternal pride, financing his son's campaigns through increasingly creative methods: indulgences, benefices, even the sale of cardinals' hats. Gold flowed from the faithful into the Vatican coffers, and from there into Cesare's war chest. The Pope's prayers were for conquest, his blessings for victory. Cesare's rise was meteoric. By the turn of the century, he was not merely the Pope's son, but one of the most feared men in Europe. Princes courted his favor, ambassadors scrambled to secure his alliances, and Italy trembled at his advance. Yet beneath his brilliance lay a simple truth. Cesare was not just fighting for himself, He was the weapon of Alexander VI, the sword the Pope had always longed to wield. The heart of the Borgias lay buried in the Tiber with Juan. But their future, their sharp, gleaming, merciless future, rode now in Cesare's hands. Cesare's ambitions were vast, but conquest required coin, and even the papal treasury could not keep pace with his appetite for war. To fuel his son's campaigns, Alexander VI turned the very machinery of the Church into an engine of profit. Salvation itself became currency, and Rome was transformed into the most lucrative marketplace in Europe. Indulgences, those slips of parchment that promised remission of sins, were sold with ruthless efficiency. What had once been framed as spiritual consolation for the faithful became, under Alexander, a systematic means of financing. From peasants to princes, the faithful paid in gold for absolution, their coins flowing not into charity or reform, but into Cesare's war chest. But indulgences were only the beginning. Alexander expanded the college of cardinals, not for holiness, but for revenue. Each red hat came with a staggering price tag. Wealthy families purchased cardinalates for their sons, buying not only prestige, but influence. In less than a decade, Alexander created 47 new cardinals, each appointment funneling thousands of ducats into Vatican coffers. The church hierarchy became a commodity, its most sacred offices reduced to auctions where salvation was measured in silver. The scandal was undeniable. Ambassadors wrote home with disbelief, recording how ecclesiastical positions were sold as if they were market stalls. The papal court resembled a bazaar where everything was negotiable: dispensations, bishoprics, even pardons for crimes. The air of Rome reeked of commerce, not sanctity, and yet in the short term it worked. Cesare's armies marched on freshly purchased blood. Castles fell, cities were conquered, and the Borgias tightened their grip on central Italy. What made the corruption even more grotesque was the theatricality of Alexander's court. While priests in the streets begged for reform, the Pope presided over banquets glittering with silver and song. Servants poured wine into golden goblets as if the Vatican were an emperor's palace. The same halls that hosted solemn masses by day transformed into theatres of indulgence by night. Courtesans, merchants, and nobles mingled freely, their laughter echoing beneath frescoes of Christ and saints. It was a contradiction so stark that even hardened observers struggled to reconcile it. How could the man who claimed to be Christ's vicar also be the chief merchant of forgiveness? How could the shepherd of souls treat the church like a pawn shop, trading away salvation for ducats? The answer was simple: because he could. Power had bent holiness to ambition, and Alexander VI wielded both without shame. Yet this very corruption planted seeds that would later shake the church to its foundations. In Germany, murmurs grew among scholars and priests, discontent that salvation could be bought like grain at market. Within a generation, Martin Luther would nail his theses to a church door, igniting a fire that would roar across Christendom. And when he listed the abuses that demanded reform, he would find in Alexander's reign a perfect example, a pope who had sold the sacred to fund a dynasty of ambition. But in the year 1500, such reckoning still lay ahead. For now, Alexander's system of spiritual commerce thrived, and Cesare's armies marched ever forward. The price of salvation was no longer measured in prayer, but in gold, and the Borgias were rich indeed. Among the Borgia children, none has provoked more fascination or more slander than Lucrezia. History has painted her alternately as victim, temptress, saint, and schemer, her name whispered with rumors that refused to die. But behind the layers of gossip and scandal lay a young woman caught in the relentless machinery of her father's ambition. From the moment she reached adolescence, Lucrezia's destiny was not her own. Alexander VI saw her as a living treaty, a bond to be sealed with wax and rings. At 13, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, a powerful nobleman from Milan. For a time, their union cemented the alliance between the Borgias and the Sforza family. But alliances in Renaissance Italy shifted like sand. When Alexander's needs changed, so too did Lucrezia's marriage. The Pope ordered an annulment, claiming Giovanni was impotent. The accusation was humiliating, scandalous, and very likely false. Yet the marriage was dissolved, and Lucrezia was once more a pawn awaiting her next placement on the chessboard of power. Her second marriage was to Alfonso of Aragon, illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This union tied the Borgias to southern Italy, strengthening their hold over the peninsula. Yet this bond too became disposable. When Cesare shifted allegiance toward France, Alfonso was no longer useful. In 1500 he was attacked and brutally wounded on the steps of St. Peter's. While he lay recovering, assassins returned to finish the job. Whispers claimed Cesare himself ordered the murder. Whether or not Lucrezia loved Alfonso, his death left her widowed, humiliated, and once again a piece to be moved. It was in these shifting roles, bride, widow, bride again, that Lucrezia's reputation began to darken. Rome, always hungry for gossip, whispered tales of incest, of forbidden love between father and daughter, between brother and sister. Some claimed she carried a ring laced with poison used to dispose of rivals at papal banquets. Others painted her as the willing participant in the family's depravity, a femme fatale cloaked in silks and shadows. But how much of this was truth and how much invention? Renaissance Rome was a city where rumor was weapon, where enemies sharpened words as keenly as daggers. To accuse Lucrezia of incest or murder was to strike at the very heart of Alexander VI's dynasty. And yet, the persistence of these stories has left her image forever blurred. Half victim, half villain. A woman trapped in the myths her family inspired. What cannot be denied is her resilience. In 1502 she was married yet again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. Unlike her earlier unions, this marriage endured. In Ferrara, away from the poisoned atmosphere of Rome, Lucrezia grew into a respected duchess, a patron of the arts, a mother. Those who knew her in later years spoke of her dignity, her grace, her devotion to her people. Yet the stain of her youth could not be washed away. To many, she would always remain the Borgia daughter, the pawn who may have learned at last how to play. Lucrezia's story is one of contradictions, the obedient child and the whispered temptress, the pawn of her father's ambition and the duchess who carved her own place in history. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. Perhaps she was both victim and player, caught in a game where love, loyalty, and survival blurred beyond recognition. By the year 1500, the Borgias stood at the very summit of their power. Alexander VI had reigned for nearly a decade, his dynasty firmly entrenched in the papal court, his children scattered across Italy's thrones and alliances. Cesare rode at the head of armies feared from Florence to Naples. Lucrezia, though scarred by scandal, was married once more into nobility. Even the Jubilee year of 1500, meant to be a celebration of Christian renewal, had swelled the papal coffers with unprecedented wealth. Rome itself groaned under the contradictions of this golden age. Pilgrims arrived in droves to seek forgiveness, their prayers rising like incense before altars glowing with candlelight. But outside those same churches, the city's taverns and brothels overflowed. Ambassadors from Europe's great courts walked the streets, trading intelligence by day and indulging in vices by night. Merchants counted coins, soldiers paraded, and papal officials sold blessings like market wares. Rome had become both holy capital and carnival, sacred stage and profane marketplace. At the center of it all stood Alexander VI. He was no longer merely a pope, but a monarch in all but name. His public appearances glittered with magnificence, golden processions, banquets laden with exotic foods, choruses echoing through St. Peter's. Yet these spectacles were not only for devotion, they were political theatre, carefully staged to remind the world that the papacy was as powerful as any crown in Europe. Within the Vatican walls, the atmosphere grew ever more decadent. The papal apartments became a theatre where boundaries dissolved. Cardinals dined alongside courtesans, nobles whispered alliances over goblets of wine, and music carried through frescoed halls until dawn. Guests marveled not at sanctity but at indulgence, at the audacity with which Alexander turned sacred space into a court of excess. Cesare's victories added to the aura of invincibility. Backed by French arms and papal gold, he carved out dominions in Romagna with ruthless speed. Imola, Forlì, Rimini, each fell before him, their rulers cast aside. His cruelty was feared, his efficiency admired. Machiavelli himself, dispatched as Florentine envoy, watched in astonishment as Cesare mastered both war and deception, a living embodiment of the merciless pragmatism that would later fill the pages of The Prince. But this grandeur came at a cost. The papal treasury strained under the weight of Cesare's campaigns, forcing Alexander to exploit every corner of the church for revenue. Indulgences, benefices, even cardinalships became commodities. Salvation was sold, holiness auctioned. The line between spiritual authority and financial transaction had all but vanished. And yet, far from weakening the Borgias, the corruption seemed only to embolden them. Those who opposed them learned quickly the price of resistance. Rivals were silenced by assassination or intimidation. Critics found themselves isolated, their influence stripped away. To cross the Borgias was to gamble with one's life. For Rome's citizens, the city was a paradox. In daylight, they saw the Pope dispensing blessings, restoring order, presiding over ceremonies that glittered with sanctity. By night, they heard rumors of feasts that descended into debauchery, of mistresses parading through sacred halls, of cardinals complicit in scandals too outrageous to speak aloud. The papacy itself had become a mask, outwardly holy, inwardly consumed by desire. It was in this atmosphere, triumphant, decadent, untouchable, that the Borgias prepared for the most infamous spectacle of all. On the eve of All Hallows, October 31st, 1501, Cesare would host an entertainment that blurred the final line between sacred dignity and profane indulgence. It would be remembered forever as the Banquet of Chestnuts. The night was October 31st, 1501, All Hallows Eve. Across Europe, it was a time when the living prayed for the souls of the dead, when church bells tolled for saints and sinners alike. But in Rome, behind the heavy doors of the Vatican, a very different ritual was about to unfold. Cesare Borgia, at the height of his power, prepared to host an entertainment that would push beyond even the loose boundaries of Renaissance excess. The setting was his private apartments within the Apostolic Palace, chambers decorated by the painter Pinturicchio with frescoes of saints and ancient myths. Walls that depicted divine sacrifice and pagan triumph alike now stood as silent witnesses to a spectacle that would desecrate both traditions at once. The guest list was as shocking as the event itself. Cardinals who should have spent the night in prayer sat beside Roman nobles whose families had long traded whispers with the Borgias. Ambassadors representing kingdoms across Europe found themselves invited, perhaps curious, perhaps complicit. The presence of such dignitaries was no accident. Cesare knew that scandal, when shared among powerful men, bound them together in complicity. But the true centerpiece of the evening was not the nobles or even the hosts. It was the 50 courtesans, hand-picked for their beauty and their discretion, assembled as though they were part of the papal household itself. These women were not common prostitutes dragged from Rome's street. They were refined, skilled in the art of pleasure and conversation, capable of flattering a man into silence or coaxing secrets from his lips. They were entertainment, temptation, and currency all at once. The banquet began in ordinary splendor. Silver platters bore roasted meats and delicacies seasoned with rare spices. Wines from the papal cellars flowed into goblets, their deep red gleam catching the candlelight. Conversation rose in waves, politics, art, gossip of war and marriage, until the atmosphere thickened, not with incense, but with desire. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, was present that night. He did not join the revelry, but his duty required his presence. His pen, silent during the feast, would later record the night in his Liber Notarum with a detachment that chills even centuries later. He would note the names of those present, the events that unfolded, and the obscene contests that turned the Vatican into a carnival of lust. As the meal ended and the music swelled, servants cleared the tables, and the courtesans entered the chamber. Draped in silks that clung to their bodies, they began to dance, their movements growing bolder with every cup of wine poured for the watching cardinals and nobles. The flicker of candlelight made their jewels gleam, their shadows stretching across frescoes of saints who seemed, in that moment, powerless to look away. Then, as the night grew darker, garments fell, the dances became bolder still, and what began as entertainment slipped into something altogether more dangerous, an inversion of sanctity itself. Where prayers should have risen, laughter and desire echoed. Where saints had once been venerated, lust was paraded. The Vatican had become a stage, and its actors were cardinals, courtesans, and the very family of the Pope. At the center of it all, watching from a seat of honor, sat Alexander VI himself. To his side stood Cesare, the architect of the evening, and, astonishingly, Lucrezia. Her presence that night would puzzle historians for centuries. Was she a victim, forced to attend the grotesque theater of her father and brother? Or was she, as some claimed, a participant in the family's deliberate defiance of moral law? No source agrees, but all concur that she was there, her name bound forever to the most infamous orgy in papal history. The night had only begun. The scandal would soon reach its climax, marked not only by wine and flesh, but by the humble fruit that gave the night its unforgettable name, chestnuts. As the night advanced, the banquet transformed into something darker, something that would forever etch itself into the memory of Europe. The servants cleared the last of the platters. Candlesticks were lifted from the tables and set upon the floor, creating small islands of flickering light amid long stretches of shadow. The air was heavy with wine, perfume, and anticipation. Then came the chestnuts. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, were scattered across the marble floor between the pools of candlelight. The courtesans, now unclothed, were ordered to crawl on hands and knees to gather them, their bodies illuminated by the trembling light. Their laughter and movements turned the sacred halls of the papal palace into an obscene spectacle, a grotesque parody of humility, where the symbols of autumn harvest became tokens of lust. Burchard, ever precise, recorded the moment without flourish. His Latin entry is spare, clinical. The women moved about the floor collecting chestnuts, while the Pope, Cesare, and Lucrezia watched. It is this very dryness, this refusal to sensationalize, that makes the scene so haunting. No embellishment is needed. The act speaks its own blasphemy. But the night did not end with spectacle alone. Soon contests were announced. The male guests, nobles, clerics, ambassadors, were invited to prove their virility in a competition to see who could bed the most courtesans. Prizes were prepared: tunics of silk, finely wrought shoes, ornate caps, items of luxury, tokens of prestige, awarded not for wisdom or courage, but for indulgence. Servants were appointed to keep count, transforming intimacy into sport, pleasure into record. At the head of it all sat Alexander VI, enthroned like a master of ceremonies in his own Vatican. His son Cesare leaned close, the architect of the evening's corruption, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a conqueror, even in decadence. And beside them, silent and enigmatic, was Lucrezia. Her presence that night has haunted historians for centuries. Was she forced, unwilling witness to her family's depravity? Or did she attend by choice, bound by the strange, corrupt logic of dynastic unity? The truth lies buried in shadows, but her name is inescapably bound to the scandal. For the courtesans, the night was less spectacle than survival. They performed not out of joy, but out of necessity, their profession demanding discretion in exchange for patronage. They played their role as they had been trained to do, serving pleasure for men who wielded power over their futures. Outside, Rome slept unaware. Pilgrims still knelt in prayer, believing the Vatican to be the holiest place on earth. But inside, the Pope himself presided over a desecration that mocked their faith. Burchard would later seal his account in the Vatican archives, his words destined to lie hidden for centuries. And yet the image could not be suppressed. Courtesans crawling for chestnuts under the watchful eyes of the Pope and his children. It was more than an orgy. It was a symbol of a church that had lost its sanctity, of power unrestrained, of a dynasty that mistook corruption for glory. By dawn, the candles had guttered out. The courtesans departed, the nobles slunk away, and the Vatican resumed its outward mask of holiness. Masses were sung, incense burned, and pilgrims entered St. Peter's as though nothing had happened. But the memory of that night lingered like smoke in the rafters, a stain that no incense could cleanse. When dawn broke over Rome on November 1st, 1501, the city appeared unchanged. Pilgrims filed into St. Peter's to offer prayers for All Saints' Day, unaware that only hours before the sacred halls had hosted the most infamous orgy in papal history. The Vatican's facade of holiness endured, but beneath its marble skin the foundations had cracked. News of the Banquet of Chestnuts spread quickly. Servants whispered, ambassadors reported, rival families gossiped. Within weeks, Europe knew. Even courts accustomed to decadence reacted with shock. Letters survived from foreign envoys describing the scandal with barely concealed disbelief, as if even the jaded aristocracies of Italy and France could not fathom such depravity within the papal palace. For reformers across Christendom, the event was a gift. In Florence, fiery voices like Girolamo Savonarola had already denounced Rome as a new Babylon, a whore draped in scarlet. The banquet confirmed every accusation. Preachers thundered from pulpits, pamphlets circulated, and whispers hardened into conviction. The papacy was corrupt beyond repair. Decades later, when Martin Luther would pin his theses to a church door in Wittenberg, he would find in Alexander VI's excesses the perfect symbol of all he sought to overthrow. Alexander's reaction to the scandal was as brazen as the act itself. He did not apologize, did not retreat, did not reform. Instead, he doubled down, pouring resources into Cesare's wars, selling indulgences and continuing his theatrical banquets. If anything, the exposure of his corruption freed him from pretense. He no longer needed to mask ambition with holiness. His papacy had become a dynasty, and he ruled accordingly. But history has a way of humbling even the most arrogant. In August 1503, Alexander VI fell ill, perhaps of malaria, perhaps poisoned, perhaps simply undone by age and excess. He died on the 18th of that month, leaving behind a legacy as notorious as any pope in history. Cesare, stripped of papal protection, quickly lost his territories and died just 4 years later as a mercenary in Spain. Lucrezia alone endured, remaking herself as Duchess of Ferrara, remembered in her later years for dignity and patronage rather than scandal. The papacy that followed sought to bury the Borgias' shame. Pope Julius II, Alexander's successor, refused to occupy the Borgia apartments. Instead, he commissioned Raphael to paint new frescoes in rooms above them, filling the Vatican with images of philosophy and theology, an intentional contrast to the corruption that had stained the lower halls. The past could be painted over, but it could not be erased. Centuries later, when the Vatican secret archives were opened to scholars, Burchard's dry Latin entry on the Banquet resurfaced. Some Catholic historians denied its truth, calling it exaggeration or slander. Protestant writers embraced it gleefully as proof of papal corruption. Modern historians weighing the evidence conclude that while details may have blurred with retelling, the essence of Burchard's account is authentic. The Night of Chestnuts was no myth. Its legacy is more than scandal. It stands as a turning point in the history of faith and power. The Renaissance papacy, dazzling in art and politics, was also rotting from within. The Banquet revealed that rot with merciless clarity. It showed how far the sacred could fall when chained to ambition, how fragile the line between holiness and desecration truly was. The chestnuts scattered across marble floors became symbols, merely of lust, but of the collapse of moral authority. They rolled through history, whispered by preachers, recorded by chroniclers, debated by scholars. They are still with us, reminders that power without restraint corrupts absolutely, even in the holiest of places. As we look back now, 5 centuries later, we see in that night a mirror of humanity itself. The same hands that built cathedrals also scattered chestnuts for courtesans. The same church that preached salvation also sold it for gold. And the same papacy that crowned saints also crowned sinners. The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than an orgy. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the eternal struggle between sacred calling and human desire, between the promise of heaven and the temptation of power. And though the candles of that night have long since guttered out, their shadows still flicker across history.